All right, so welcome to everybody joining us here this morning as we talk about Title IX in K-12 schools. For those of you who don't know me, given that this is a public training, my name is Bridget Koestner. I am the policy manager here at the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence. So I do a lot of work around various policies, typically state policies, but also things like Title IX that are federal. And I have done a lot of higher ed work in the last few years in regards to victim advocacy. So this is a topic that I'm particularly passionate about. And I think Title IX is something that we don't always talk about in the context of K-12 schools, but I think it's really important that we do. So with that, I'm going to get started. I just want to let folks know, as I had said before we jumped on the recording, we will have time for a Q&A at the end today. However, we will end the recording at that time. So I just appreciate if you stick in here with me, write down any questions that you have, and I'd be happy to answer. If you're watching the recording of this program, you're also more than welcome to reach out to me. My contact information will be at the end of the presentation. So I would be happy to answer any questions that you have about Title IX, including in its application to K-12 spaces. So with that, for folks who might not be totally familiar with the Alliance, we work to prevent and eliminate sexual violence in the state of Connecticut. We do this through education, legislation, our advocacy work, trauma-informed care, and a statewide network of support for victims and survivors. We believe that sexual violence is a preventable public health epidemic, and we do believe that things can be better than they are, and we know that we are stronger when we all work together. So in that spirit, we have 9 sexual assault crisis centers throughout the state of Connecticut that are part of the Alliance. We have a post-conviction victim advocacy program, and we also have a victims' rights legal advocacy program. So we're going to jump in and understand Title IX, a little bit about its history, where we're coming from when we talk about it, and what would qualify as a Title IX issue. So Title IX, we always say, is a short statute that has a very far-reaching impact. So it's written here: no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from the participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So essentially, Title IX ensures that individuals will have access to education if they are experiencing some type of sex-based discrimination or harassment, because their school is receiving federal funding, and therefore there should be this equal access, right? We understand that schools have unique opportunities and abilities, as well as civil rights obligations to address sex-based harassment. So we also note that sex-based discrimination and harassment will impact someone's education, oftentimes in regards to whether or not they can go to class, where they're living, things of that nature, again, depending on what setting we're talking about. And so schools do have this obligation to be responsive. They are able to carry out, Title IX policies thanks to, of course, this statute. And then what that looks like is dictated through a series of federal regulations. It's a pretty hefty collection of them. And this is pretty new. We'll talk a little bit about current events around Title IX, but the current structure of operating with these regulations is something that institutions are still adjusting to, and it's something that there's been less talk about in K-12 environments than in higher education. So I'm definitely happy to walk through some of that today. So what qualifies under Title IX? Because we do know that not necessarily all types of harassment and things will qualify. because there needs to sort of be this loop in regards to, it needs to be essentially looped in with their educational space and access to education. So under Title IX, we're going to be talking about what, most people typically think about, I think, when Title IX comes up, which is fair and equitable athletic programs. Of course, ensuring that individuals, regardless of sex, do have access to the, athletic programs of their choice and the same abilities, to succeed at their school. Additionally, though, kind of where we're going to be digging into today is more of the sexual harassment piece. So under the Title IX regulations, this can show up in really kind of two different ways. There's the classic quid pro quo sort of scenario. So somebody may get some sort of aid or benefit or service in, exchange for some sort of sexual conduct. So for instance, this could be a student at a high school who is offered some kind of boost in a grade, but in exchange for some sort of sexual action or relationship with the person who is giving that grade. We also know that sexual harassment consists of unwelcome conduct that is so severe, pervasive, and objectively offensive that it does exclude someone from accessing their education. This particular definition is a pretty high threshold. This is pretty new to the regulations that were implemented in 2020. And hopefully this is something that we will see change. However, this is the definition that we have at this time. And it's important that the department has clarified that this can include a single significant instance of harassment, or it can be a series of kind of varying severities of harassment, and recognizing that the accumulation of those instances would perhaps keep somebody from being able to access their education. So this could look like somebody repeatedly kind of asking out or pursuing a student despite their declining, despite their being uncomfortable, or this can be a one-time instance where somebody pursues someone in a way that is particularly severe and offensive. And then in addition, sexual assault, as it is defined in other federal statutes, domestic violence and dating violence, as well as stalking, are going to fall under Title IX, and again, are pretty explicitly defined in there. But it, again, is a short statute with a far reach because these are lots of different types of offenses that can qualify. So where is Title IX relevant? Because whenever we're talking about issues of education, this is going to be something that, again, we need to consider whether or not the school does have an obligation based on where these individuals were when this harassment occurred. So naturally, any sort of quote unquote on campus or on school ground incidents are going to fall under Title IX. So if somebody is, outside of their school in the parking lot even, or they are, in a classroom, they're in the hallways, these are places that the school does have kind of a reasonable amount of power over these areas, right? And so therefore, they have that obligation to protect students in those spaces or to respond if those students experience something there. However, the department has clarified, and we're coming to understand additional places where this can kind of play out. So this can also include online spaces using a school platform. So say, when we were kind of all on lockdown and people were learning remotely, if during a remote class, a student in a side conversation was experiencing some sort of harassment, that would be something that the institution would have to investigate and act on. And then additionally, there have been some cases with school devices. So if it's a school issued Chromebook or something of that nature, the school may need to investigate because it essentially kind of took place within their realm. The institution should also always be addressing school-sponsored activities where the school had what the department calls substantial control. So where they essentially had or should have had kind of control over the environment, right? So if this is something that happens on a field trip that students are going on or something like that, if the school is sponsoring it, it's something that they're going to have to be responsive to, even if it were kind of off campus, not on school grounds, and even if it was not within the normal school hours. And then it's also important to note, because this is something that the department has kind of made clear, is that this is within the United States. So even if, say, there's a school-sponsored activity, but it is a trip abroad to another country, that would actually no longer fall under Title IX, because Title IX explicitly protects students who are in the US. While this has not always been the case, this was dictated in the 2020 regulations and therefore is the current way of things. So this is something we may see change over time, but at this point, it is really within the United States. It's important to note that institutions should be investigating whether or not the geography is going to qualify. So that's something that they're going to really need to look into and discern, and they shouldn't be writing off a case just immediately without investigating whether any of what has occurred has been under their substantial control. So what if a case doesn't qualify, right? So what if it doesn't fall under one of those definitions? What if it doesn't fall under one of these geographies? We understand that it could be the case that it doesn't fit one of these definitions, or it wasn't in one of these places, but it's still something that's disruptive to somebody's education. It's still something that they essentially need some remedy for. So what are we going to do in these particular cases to ensure that victims of these crimes and survivors are able to access some help and gain more access to their education? So what's really important to look at is what misconduct policies already exist at the school. So a lot of schools are going to have their own kind of code of conduct that is going to dictate how they can respond to incidents that might fall outside of this Title IX definition. And so these are things that are going to be generally very accessible to students and the public. And so it's always something worth looking into. It's something worth asking a school about if a student's experiencing something that doesn't fit within kind of these typical Title IX boundaries. We also, of course, as the Alliance and just in general as advocates, recommend going to a community-based crisis center to see if there is any support that can be provided through that space, and what an advocate can kind of do in terms of either collaborating with the school or providing access to things like counseling. And so that's something that is important to consider as well as a service that's available. And then, of course, somebody can report to the police department and see if what they are dealing with is something that the police department would be able to potentially handle. Again, recognizing that they may do so in collaboration with the school or independently. So there are some other options, of course, I think those first two being a bit more accessible and perhaps a bit more of what somebody would be looking like in a case where there's a Title IX incident. However, there are families that will go to the police department if there are situations, especially those that involve something that is clearly criminal, such as harassment from an adult to a child. So now that we understand a bit about where we're going to have Title IX cases, what they're going to be defined as, we're going to talk a little bit through what these processes are actually going to look like. What's going to happen if somebody decides to report? What is that investigation going to look like? And what are some of the resolutions and supportive measures that can be offered to students who are in these situations? So if somebody does decide to report and move forward with a case, this is information that's going to go to a Title IX coordinator. It's important to note that a victim is not always going to be the one person that is reporting. This is sort of a difference that we see often in higher ed and K through 12 spaces. In K through 12 spaces, it's tends to be more common that a victim won't be the person who is reporting the instance, because there are more people who are obligated to inform the institution. So teachers and school employees, as mandated reporters, are going to have to report instances of sexual violence, right, and dating violence and stalking and things of that nature that come to their attention. And we also know that in K through 12 environments, a lot of the time, these reports will come to a Title IX coordinator because there's another student that is aware of what's happening, that's concerned, and who has decided to intervene on behalf of their peers. So this is important to note because we want to ensure that we're always giving victims and survivors as much agency as possible through these processes. But of course, there's going to be less agency in these situations where there is a minor. And so we want to see where we can still give them some choice and how we can ensure that they feel empowered through the process. So there are different routes that these cases can take. There can be a formal Title IX investigation, or somebody can be seeking from the gate an informal resolution. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what these things mean. The investigations, again, are going to be more formal, and there's going to be potentially consequences for the party that has done harm. In the situation of an informal resolution and somebody wanting to pursue that, we're more so focused on just achieving supportive measures for the student who has been harmed so that they still have access to their education. So it's important to note that this is something that may or may not be a choice. If the school has concern, for instance, that there's a greater public safety issue at their school based on the information that has come to their attention, they may have to do a formal investigation to look at the extent that harm has been done thus far, correct that harm to whatever extent they can, and prevent it from happening in the future. So all of those steps may require them to have this formal investigation, regardless of what the victim in the case might actually be seeking or request. But sometimes there is some room for there to be a choice in the matter. If somebody would like to pursue a more formal investigation, or somebody just wants to know what support is available for them. Again, this is something that is going to depend on desired outcome. So I think investigation, in addition to sort of being the source of punishment for the student, is sometimes also warranted when, or for the student that did harm. It's also warranted in situations where perhaps the student who was harmed doesn't feel as if they were offered everything that they would need through the initial request for informal resolutions. So they're going to kind of move forward with more investigation, so the institution has an understanding of the whole scope of the issue. And it depends on the sort of outcome the institution is seeking. If they really see this as something that's impacting one student, you know, they can pursue that informal resolution more easily, versus if this is something that has a wider reach and they know that there's been a greater community impact, you know, there's greater likelihood they're going to choose a more formal investigation. And then something else we need to acknowledge, in either a higher ed or K through 12 situation, you have the possibility of police involvement, because the person who has experienced harm may also report to the police. However, due to mandatory reporting and the potential DCF involvement, there's definitely that perhaps stronger likelihood that there's going to be some sort of law enforcement and or DCF involvement in these cases, because there's a minor who has been harmed. So there's likely to be that sort of collaboration with the institution. So the other thing that's worth mentioning in regards to reporting and kind of kicking off this process is that there are institutions that will claim religious exemption to these particular instances. So because of the 2020 regulations that have been implemented, the schools no longer have to state upfront if they're seeking religious exemption from any of the Title IX rules. Schools can essentially say that they believe that one of the regulations regarding how they should be responding to victims and survivors is something that goes against one of their religious tenets, and therefore they should not have to enforce it because of their freedom of religion. The way that this works now is that the institution can claim that exemption at any time. So a student could report, not have the institution follow up, kind of continue to approach them and be told at some point or another that the case isn't moving forward because they're claiming a religious exemption. And it really wouldn't be until a student makes a complaint about that exemption that there would really need to be too much formality to claiming it. So this is something that I, don't love about the 2020 regulations. There's a number of things that are problematic, but this is one piece that's difficult because there is not going to be that exemption stated up front, which I think would be important for survivors. However, it's important to understand that regardless of when, where, and how this exemption is being brought up, it is something that the institutions are sort of obligated to explain and still do some work around. So if somebody does decide to pursue a more formal investigation, the individuals involved are both going to be able to have advisors through this situation. And as they're moving through this process, they also both should be receiving written notice of what is being reported by the student who has experienced the harm. And so they understand essentially why they're there and what's going to happen next. So that written notice will also kind of talk through what this process might look like to some extent, including what they need to do next. Students should also be provided with measures that can be taken to provide them with some relief from this violence and harassment while the case is ongoing. So these supportive measures, we're going to talk through them, but they're essentially things that victims can do and ways survivors can avoid the person who's harmed them, avoid places that provide them with a level of anxiety, essentially just some reasonable accommodations to ensure they're continuing to access their education. Interim measures can look like this as well. However, they can also include sometimes action to the person who's been harmed. It's important to note that while there is a presumption of innocence for the person that has done harm, which we'll discuss next, regardless of that presumption of innocence, should there be a situation where there is an active threat to the school community, administrative leave or temporary suspension can be deemed appropriate as measures that can be taken against the person who has done harm in ensuring that not only is the victim protected from that person, but also they can continue to do harm in the school community. And then the presumption of innocence, as I had just stated, exists for the person who's been reported to have done the harm. And so this essentially states that unless there's a finding otherwise, that they're presumed to be innocent. This is also something that's pretty new to these 2020 regulations and something that has been pretty significantly debated. But what's important to note is that regardless of the presumption of innocence, a victim cannot be presumed to have lied. So just because they have that innocence does not mean that the school can hold a victim or survivor accountable for lying. unless they prove that such a thing happened in bad faith. But even if that person is not found to be responsible for the harm that's occurred, that person who had done that harm, the victim should not be held accountable for essentially lying about what has happened. So they're going to move forward with both the investigation, kind of this fact finding, pulling witnesses, talking to them. The investigation process is going to move forward from the Title IX office, and then there's going to be a decision making. So once they have a finding of whether or not the person who has been reported to have done the harm is responsible for it, they're going to then decide what measures need to be extended to that case based on their conclusion. So if the person has been found to be responsible, there's a greater likelihood of them facing some punishment for it, right? And regardless of what happens, there are supports that can be offered to victims and survivors. There needs to be an objective evaluation of evidence. So whoever is responsible for that needs to ensure that they are able to make some objective decisions and don't have anything clouding their judgment in regards to their relationship with either parties. There needs to be a reasonable and prompt time frame. People shouldn't be left hanging, not knowing what the status of the investigation is. They should always kind of know what the next step is going to look like. They always have a right to ask and get an answer when they ask about what that next step is going to look like. And this is something that cannot unreasonably drag on in understanding how impactful it is to everybody involved. So this is something that a grievance process that should be taking place in a reasonable time frame. There can be a hearing in a K-12 environment. However, it's not as likely as it is in higher ed spaces for there to be a more formal hearing process. Usually there's going to be some Title IX process that is a bit less formal than the sort of formal hearing we'd see in a higher ed space. And then ultimately, there's going to be a written determination of the outcome of the case. So whether or not the person was held responsible, and then each party will kind of know what measures are accessible or being offered to them. But both parties should get a written determination of the outcome of the case. And this written outcome is also going to include information about how they can appeal the case should they be of the belief that there's some reason that they should be able to be heard further. So in comparison to these formal sort of investigations, there can also be informal resolutions to these instances, and these can occur from the gate. So somebody can kind of, as they are reporting, say that they don't want the other person to get in trouble. They don't want to go through anything significant. They just want to switch their class. They just want to be on a different school bus. And that can be a process, that the institution can move through, kind of one of these more informal processes to ensure that that's available to them. This can also look like a more restorative justice-based process if that's something that the institution offers, but essentially it's going to be a non-investigative, more informal alternative. This can be requested at any time. So say a student does choose to move forward with a formal case and it becomes overwhelming for them, and they would rather just have an informal resolution in place, they can request to do that instead. And the institution should begin the informal resolution process instead of that time. They must explain the process in writing, what's available to them, what their rights are, things of that nature. And they also should be providing a list of the supportive measures that are potentially available to the person to ensure their continued access to education. So we're talking a good amount about supportive measures. Just to kind of cover that, supportive measures are essentially accommodations that an institution is going to provide to help restore someone's access to education. So we're going to go through a few examples of what institutions can offer, but typically we see supportive measures as things that the survivor or victim is going to do that is going to ensure that they can continue to go to their classes, continue to be in their school community without experiencing the fear, trauma, and everything related to their experience of sexual violence. that would potentially keep them from accessing their education wholly. So this is something that should be provided. This information is something that should be provided to staff. It's also something that can be in place as long as somebody might need it. So if a school year ends and as the new one begins, a student still feels as if they're anxious to go back to school, they're concerned about being in a certain place in the building, on a certain bus, something of that nature, then the accommodation can continue as long as it's needed. And we're going to be talking through a few more concrete examples of what this can look like. I will say that the supportive measures that we're going to be listing, this list is by no means exhaustive, and these categories are not formally laid out so much as just the way I've chosen to organize them. But there's really some more common supportive measures that we see that are implemented on a regular basis. And sometimes institutions are a bit more creative based upon what resources they have and what needs that victim or survivor has. However, in regards to things that we kind of see more frequently, around safety, they can have no contact orders implemented so that the victim and survivor will not be contacted by the person who's done them harm, and vice versa. The two parties won't contact one another. They may be able to switch them to a different space. So if there is a class that they no longer feel safe in, they want a certain seat in the classroom because it makes them feel more safe and comfortable. A different lunchroom, hallway route, bus, things of that nature. The institution has the power and essentially upon request the obligation to allow that student to go to a different space. They also can provide assistance in transferring the student. So say the institution at large is no longer a safe place for that person. The institution as a supportive measure can be helping to transfer them to another school that would allow them to access education in a way that is safe. In regards to mental health, there are some different options that can be offered. Individuals can get counseling through the school or a referral to counseling from the school, but ensuring some access to counseling is something that is a supportive measure that can be offered. They can provide students with hall passes. Sometimes, these are given different names, but often this will be a hall pass that the student can kind of utilize anytime they need it. And this can help them know that they can escape situations that might not feel safe to them. And so this is something that institutions can potentially offer if that would be something that's helpful for the student to not feel trapped and to have some agency and to know that, say, they are experiencing a panic attack or something like that, they can kind of immediately go to the nurse or the bathroom or something in order to have a safe place. And then connecting students with local resources in their community is also a supportive measure that can be taken. So that can be connecting them with a local rape crisis center, that can be connecting them with a local counseling center, that can be coordinating with the law enforcement, but helping make that connection and bridge that relationship is something that institutions can do that would be supportive. In regards to some academic support, the institution can excuse absences and latenesses that are associated with this person's experience. So say they've gotten into some trouble because they keep showing up late for school, because they no longer feel safe getting on their old bus, or because they no longer feel comfortable going to their first period class. The institution can provide some support in excusing some of those absences and lateness to ensure that the student is going to feel comfortable continuing to access their education and isn't going to be limited based upon absences and lateness. They also can get extension on assignments if necessary, based on what they're going through, based on, if they're trying to kind of catch up. They also can have remote class options that are available for students. if they do not feel comfortable going into school or don't feel comfortable going into a certain classroom. And then there's also tutoring that can be available, and the institution can offer tutoring to students that, again, might have fallen behind due to the mental health impact, or maybe just some of the more practical impacts around what's happened to them. And then amnesty is a provision that can be critically important in these school environments, because a lot of the time students will be afraid to come forward because they themselves are afraid that they're going to get in trouble for something that they've done. So amnesty is something that really should be provided in these institutions in a case where there has not been harm to another person. So sometimes an institution will have to move forward with some sort of response. Say a student gets into a physical altercation and physically harms another student because they were arguing over some element of the sexual violence that student experienced. They may have to move forward with that because there's been a harm to another person. However, if there are other school rules that are broken that do not harm others, things like substance use, maybe we've seen this with students who might not have been following a COVID protocol. The student should not be punished for anything that they've have done that doesn't have that element of harm. Another exception to this would be is if the school has a quote unquote zero tolerance policy, because often there's kind of no exception for amnesty in these situations. So if they had done something that falls under a zero tolerance policy, the institution can technically and will potentially hold them accountable under that policy for something that they've done. And then amnesty is also not relevant in a case where there has been a report that was not in good faith or a report that was in bad faith. So essentially something somebody said that was knowingly false. But of course, we know that survivors are very unlikely to lie about what's happened to them. And so that's not something we see frequently. A finding of not responsibility on behalf of the person who had done harm is not enough to show a bad faith report. So even if that person is found not to be responsible, that fact alone cannot imply that the reporting student was lying or the victim or survivor was lying. And so this amnesty piece is definitely important because it helps students be honest through their case. It helps them to trust the individuals that are around them, who are going to be ideally helping them. So that's something as well we would want to consider. It's also important to note that supportive measures can be offered at any time. They can be sought at any time. They can be changed at any time. And they are available regardless of whether or not a student decides to report formally. And they are available even if the offending student is found to be not responsible. So if there's a case where somebody doesn't get the help that they need, there is some further action that they can take to ensure that their rights are being respected by the institution, being acknowledged. If a school does decide to decline to provide somebody with supportive measures, they should be explaining in writing why they deemed those accommodations unnecessary and why they aren't being provided. So that's something that somebody can always ask for as sort of an accountability measure from their institution. And this can kind of help figure out, okay, is this something that they are willing to offer and maybe just aren't doing so in a timely fashion? Or is this something that they've genuinely declined? And so it helps to have documentation for that. And so that's something people can always request. As I stated earlier, in one of these formal cases, the student may have various grounds on which they can appeal the case. So if they feel that the determination was somehow unfair, they can choose to move forward with an appeal. Should there be an issue with a school implementing Title IX or not implementing Title IX in a way that creates that discrimination, creates unequal access to education, then the school can have an investigation done by the U.S. Department of Education. This would be called an OCR report, as the Office of Civil Rights would be investigating the claims that have been made against the institution to see the extent of perhaps what they have done that was harmful, or how they might have neglected the case. I can definitely share more information in the Q&A, and if anybody has questions about OCR, I would say it's can be a very effective method. However, it is a very long-term method. So it usually does take some period of time. And it's also something that is very prescriptive in terms of some of the timelines in which people need to report, turn things in. So I definitely will talk more about resources later, but I'd recommend potentially accessing some legal report should somebody want to pursue an OCR report to ensure that they're checking all the boxes. That being said, legal support is something that students may be able to access throughout any of these steps or processes. So if they're going through an investigation, if they're going through an appeal, if it's after the fact and they still feel they need supportive measures that aren't being offered, having a lawyer can be really helpful. And there are, thankfully, legal support avenues out there that are free or affordable to families who are in these situations. And then lastly, I will say something that is sometimes kind of utilized as a workaround when Title IX is not providing a student with the help that they need and the accommodations that they need. It's important to acknowledge that there are disability protections that exist in U.S. schools that are likely to overlap based on the nature of these crimes. So if somebody has develops PTSD or has a worsening of an existing anxiety disorder or depression or something of that nature, the school is obligated to respond to the disability that they're experiencing by ensuring they have access to their education. So if somebody does not get what they need under Title IX, they can share that they have PTSD and that they do need accommodations, should that be a diagnosis that they are given, or a disability that applies to them. So we've talked through some of the differences between K-12 and higher ed Title IX policy, but I think that there are just a few points I'd like to make as we're at this point and have talked through some of this. So while some of what I've described with the investigations may have seemed a bit formal, right, and kind of these quote unquote formal investigations, we do know that typically higher ed spaces are going to have a more formal process. So this is something that's often more formal, more involved. And I think that that's both due to perhaps the fact that, you're typically dealing with two adults in those cases. And so they're both going to be involved and expressing and perhaps sometimes representing themselves, right? But I think this formality really primarily comes from the stakes that often exist in college and university cases, because this is also often where people live, sleep, eat. This is the community that they're a part of. Often these campuses are a small town that they sort of reside in. Even if they're commuting, it's a space where they spend more time than just for their education, likely. So because they may have some limitations, both the survivor having limitations around what they feel they can and can't access after an experience of sexual violence, as well as what the offending student can be prevented from accessing should they be found responsible, because there are all of these different elements involved with housing and dining halls and things of that nature. There's kind of this additional formality that's extended in higher ed cases that just we don't necessarily see in K through 12. Not to say they're not formal or prescriptive, but just not to the same extent. There's also the mandated reporting element that exists in K through 12 environments that's more rare in higher ed. So the mandated reporting element exists in a variety of ways. It involves who's going to have to inform the Title IX office and the institution of something they're aware of. It's going to perhaps influence whether they need to get DCF, the police and or another entity involved. It's going to likely impact the involvement and knowledge of parents. So we see in a lot of higher ed cases, students and staff who experience sexual violence choose not to tell their families and choose to go through this on their own rather than getting their families involved. But students in K through 12 environments, because of this mandated reporting element, because they're minors, are much less likely to have that kind of privacy. And with that being said, victim agency is a big difference. So because there's going to have to potentially be mandated reporting, because there's going to need to be some certain steps that are taken to pursue a case, even if the victim is not the one that reports it, the victim doesn't have the same level of agency in a K through 12 space that they would in a higher ed space. And it's really just the nature of them, again, being minors. And there are, again, ways that we should be ensuring that students feel they have a sense of agency in their case and are involved in communicating. Higher ed is more likely to involve cross-examinations. This is something that, in fact, is required under the Title IX regulations that were implemented in 2020. There are various formats in regards to what these cross-examinations could look like, but they do take place in a live hearing environment. Should a higher ed student choose to pursue a formal investigation. In K through 12 spaces, there aren't really going to be these cross-examinations. Both sides, instead, what will typically happen are going to get a list of questions that the other side wants answered. So they're going to review and answer those questions and submit those. But that would sort of be instead of a formal cross-examination, which we've seen as something that's harmful about the 2020 regulations in higher ed. So it's good that we can avoid that in K through 12 spaces. And then it's important to acknowledge too that while some of the same supportive measures can be offered in K through 12 and higher ed, the supportive measures are just going to be different by the nature of the K through 12 students being minors, and the higher ed students, again, living, eating, sleeping, and being involved in clubs and activities and learning on their campus. So higher ed supportive measures will often involve changes in their housing. It can ensure some protection on campus, transportation that makes that person feel safe. But when we're talking about K through 12 spaces, we are likely to focus on not only academics as we would in higher ed spaces, but also things like hallways and buses, lunchrooms, right? So we're seeing the supportive measures extended sort of to that school building and environment much more than when we're in higher ed, and there can kind of be this broader reach to a person's living environment. So all of that being said, and there will be time for questions. So I know I just threw a lot at you, so do not be concerned. But I do want to talk through, before we get to that point, what's coming up next. So what current events are we seeing? And what can you do next to support Title IX efforts in your advocacy for survivors and victims of these crimes? So as I had shared earlier, in 2020, the Trump administration under the Department of Ed, which was led by Betsy DeVos at the time, they had issued these regulations that were much more restrictive and much more prescriptive than previous Title IX guidance. It also shifted because while the federal government had previously put out guidance, this was the first time that they had regulations that had the force of law behind them. And what these regulations did is, in a lot of ways, it kind of pulled back some of the rights that survivors and victims were being offered. And it sort of, previous guidance really weighed a very equal scale between the person who had done harm and the person who was harmed. But we saw that skewed a bit, and we saw things like that presumption of innocence, things like a cross-examination that would essentially do harm to survivors, but the Department of Ed, at that time thought it was necessary and had concern for things like, quote unquote, false allegations and people who were being, quote unquote, wrongly accused, right? And this isn't something that we really saw happening much, but this was something that they focused on and created this regulation around. However, there are, because of what Title IX is and because of the way these regulations were written, there are some rights that continue to be protected under this regulation. And the Q&A doc that was released in 2021 by the department clarified the rights and protections that survivors and victims continue to have, and ways that they can continue to get supportive measures and sort of reduce the amount of harm and trauma that can be caused by these more formal investigations. And then following that, in 2022, the Biden administration proposed new regulations that would be amended to better protect victims. So that was something that we were very glad to see, and something that we are hoping is implemented in May of this year. There was a public comment period at the Alliance. We did write a public comment in favor of the new proposed regulations with a couple of points that we wanted the department to reconsider. But something we were very excited to see is that this would provide more protections for LGBTQ+ students. While there are some current protections that those students have in school environments, this would provide them with many more options and much more protection from discrimination. So we're hopeful that that will be something that will stay and be implemented. There's an evidentiary standard that was prescribed in the 2020 regulations that would start to shift back to being kind of, again, a more equitable standard, basing cases on the preponderance of the evidence rather than clear and convincing standard, which is what's, there's currently the ability to kind of utilize both. And while that ability would still exist, it would only be in certain cases. We prefer the preponderance of the evidence standard because it's essentially just more likely than not, by even a percentage point, right, that something has or has not occurred, which is the appropriate standard for these civil rights issues, including Title IX. So we're happy to see a shift back to that evidentiary standard. The definition of sexual harassment, as I had stated up front, to be severe and pervasive is a pretty significant phrase. While we know that sexual harassment and sexual assault, of course, are going to hold a lot of weight to them when they occur, severe and pervasive really implies an extent that would need to be reached at a certain point. So while I said earlier, there could be a singular incident that was so severe and pervasive that on its own, it would kind of count. However, these other cases where it kind of builds, we don't want people experiencing sexual violence and being unable to help them and telling them we can't help them until they experience more of it, right? So we want to be able to intervene at a point that would actually prevent the violence from occurring and continuing to occur. And so a new, more permissive definition will allow for that and more, in pulling back on the cross-examinations that we're seeing in higher ed spaces, things like that. So we are hopeful that this will be released in May 2023. That was something the department had said at the beginning of this calendar year in regards to the final release, but this is something that gets held up a lot in the federal government, is these sort of regulation changes. So while we are hopeful, because the sooner the better when it comes to supporting survivors with policy, but should we not see it in May of 2023, hopefully it'll be soon after. And so you may be asking yourself, what can I do to support Title IX efforts? So there are a lot that each of us can do regardless of our involvement in the school community, whether it's as an advocate, as a teacher, as an administrator, staff person. You're going to want to keep your eye out for current events because, as I said, there have been a lot of changes to Title IX. There are likely to be a lot of changes coming up. There's changes in how we're understanding its application to these cases. There's a lot of discussion right now about how it applies to protecting LGBTQ students. So continue to keep an eye out for news and current events surrounding this topic to ensure you kind of always know where things stand. Something I always say is take time to learn before you need to. So before you have a student that discloses to you and you have to figure out who the Title IX coordinator is, where they are, how you're going to tell them, and what to tell the student to expect. I definitely encourage you to look at your institutional policies, continue to learn about Title IX and learn about your obligations to report to your institution, to know the Title IX coordinator, so to know who you're referring that student to and being able to set expectations to that student when you send them off. The more we know, the more we're able to feel prepared in that moment where something this significant happens, and hopefully it doesn't. But we also know that especially folks who are advocates do face this on a regular basis. So definitely take some time to learn and be prepared before you get that disclosure. We want to ensure that responsibilities and rights to access to education that is free of sexual violence. We want to ensure these things are discussed in your community. So it's important that if there's information, right, that's relevant, it's something that can be presented, or it can be shared in various presentations and discussions. So if there is a conversation about civil rights laws, if there is, sex ed conversations, that could potentially trigger somebody to think about an instance of sexual abuse they've experienced. These are places where we can kind of talk about Title IX and how it applies, and why it's there. So definitely keeping some of that information in presentations and things of that nature is important in ensuring people kind of know what is available to them. And then also having information on hand to distribute. So this can kind of go back to taking time to learn as well. But if a student is to ask you, where to find the Title IX coordinator, just making sure you have that information nearby. And as an advocate, ensuring that you have information and resources about Title IX in K-12 environments so that families know what their rights and responsibilities are. And ultimately, we want to continue to build communities that prevent sexual violence. And all of this will help to do that. But it's also important that we're intervening, that we're not victim blaming, that we're taking time to learn about these situations and learn about, victims' rights and the dynamics of sexual violence. So as we continue to build communities that prevent sexual violence, we'll hopefully, be able to understand this issue better, be better able to support survivors, and ensure that there's an understanding that sexual violence will not be tolerated in that space. So if you're interested in learning more about this topic, aside from having chats with me, because I love Title IX and I love talking about it, so feel free to contact me anytime should you want to learn more. But also, if you would love to do your own reading, I completely understand and appreciate that. And thankfully, there are some really great resources out there. So these are kind of the top ones I would recommend. Typically, the National Women's Law Center has a lot of really great resources. They put out a lot of really great fact sheets. about Title IX and educational laws and accommodations and things of that nature. So definitely look into that and see if there's any resources on there that would be helpful to you. And then Know Your 9 is another resource similarly, but this one is really dedicated to Title IX and educational, prevention and intervention of sexual violence and things of that nature. So Know Your 9 has some toolkits. There's some student organizing information if it's something your students are interested in starting a club about in school or doing a fundraiser or awareness event for. They have a page dedicated to Title IX K-12 spaces. And so it's a great kind of FAQ if you just need to quickly kind of pull up a question about Title IX. And then in regards to getting help, the Alliance, as I mentioned at the gate, we're part of 9 community-based crisis centers. So every town in Connecticut has a crisis center that is affiliated with them. You can contact the Alliance and the member centers via our hotline, which runs in English and Spanish 24/7, or you can always use our text and chat line, which operates during the weekday hours and during the day. So I definitely recommend getting in touch with our advocates in those spaces, as they know they're incredibly helpful in these child sexual abuse and Title IX cases. If you are in another state and you're watching this, there are coalitions in every other state. So if you are unable to find them, I'm happy to direct them to you. But thankfully, what the Alliance does here in Connecticut, other organizations are doing in the state where you live. The Victims' Rights Center of Connecticut is a program of the Alliance, and they provide representation and legal information and advice to victims and survivors of crimes. So that is somewhere that individuals can turn if they need some sort of legal protections afforded. So if they wanted to have an attorney look over their case, an attorney contact the school, if it's something they need help navigating, this is somewhere that they could potentially turn. If, again, you are outside of Connecticut, our folks in the Victims' Rights Center only serve Connecticut. However, you can get in touch with the National Women's Law Center, and they will help either represent you, direct you to a resource in your state. So you can definitely always contact them, and you can find that information on their website. And you can reach out to me. Again, I enjoy talking about this. This is a topic I'm really passionate about. So I'm definitely happy to provide more information if it would be helpful to you. So thank you very, very much for listening to me talk Title IX today. There's no way I'd rather spend this fine Valentine's Day morning than discussing the intricacies of Title IX. I think for those of you who are more familiar with higher ed, it may be surprising that there is not as much that's different as you would have thought maybe between K-12 and higher ed, but we see it play out a little differently. And so I definitely can appreciate the nuances and differences, and I'm glad we talked through some of them. And I am happy to open the floor for questions. We will be stopping the recording before that time. So if anybody's watching the recording, I really appreciate that you took the time for that. And you can feel free to reach out with any questions that you have to me via email there. Again, my name is Bridget Koestner, she, her. I'm the policy manager here, and you can reach me at bridget@endsexualviolencect.org. That's bridget@endsexualviolencect.org. So definitely feel free to ask any questions that you have. And thank you so much for watching this today. And for those of you who are here in real time, I am going to end the recording over here.